All right, so what do you do when there's big businesses causing problems and you need to fix it somehow? I think we can all look at those pictures and agree that those kids that worked in those mines probably shouldn't have had that type of life, that they should be protected somehow. So let's look at some of the solutions. Let's talk about some of the terms here. I first want to put this term up here. Progressive. What is a progressive? Well, you're going to find lots of different definitions. Here's mine. A progressive is a politician, some type of government politician, political person who believes that moral problems, so when people are doing things that are naughty, should be solved with a law. So if there's something going on morally wrong, there should be a law to fix that. So for instance, if these kids were working in unsafe conditions, how do you fix that? Well, you pass a law. If people work too long and kids don't get a chance to go to school and you think that shouldn't happen, well, you can pass laws that say kids can't work, they should only go to school. That's what a progressive would do. A progressive would pass a law to help fix any moral problems that they see. So this is the part of the progressive era here, and we're going to learn a lot more about progressives coming up. But so the government starts to pass laws to help fix these problems that they see, these moral problems. So let's talk about a few. The first is the Sherman Antitrust Law. This law actually makes it illegal for trusts to exist. If a trust is too big, the government can actually break them up. Now, you might say, how does this work? How is it possible that the government can break up business? How do they get that right? Well, trusts are big corporations, so they're working all over the country. Well, in the Constitution, there is the Interstate Commerce Clause. That allows the federal government to control interstate commerce. That is one of their responsibilities in the Constitution. So the federal government does have power to break up businesses that are too big, that spread out over states. So the Sherman Antitrust Law was there to break up big governments. Now, it was passed in 1890. But not really too much enforced until a little bit later. So we're going to talk more about this law coming up in the next packet when we talk about its enforcement. But one of the things they did was pass this Sherman Antitrust Law that made it so they could break up monopolies. A monopoly is when you are the only one that sells something. For instance, let's say I make hats. And I can make hats for $1, where it costs everybody else $4 to make it. Because I'm so good, I have found a way to make hats cheap. And they're good hats. So what happens? Well, these people who sell them for $4, why would you buy a $4 hat when you can buy a $1 hat? So these people just go away. Now, what happens if somebody else finds a way to make a hat for maybe $1.25? Well, that's pretty close to $1, so if they like that hat better, they would probably buy it. Well, guess what a monopoly can do? A monopoly can come in and say, oh yeah, well, we're going to sell our hats for 50 cents. Now, they may lose a little bit of money, but what happens to this business? It goes out of business, and as soon as that business is gone, they say, well, we are selling them for $1 again. So this big monopolies can control businesses and sorry to step out of the frame there for a second, got a little excited. Get them excited, or get them to go out of business by basically underselling them. And they can afford to lose a little bit of money because they're going to make a ton of money later. They have that power. But the Sherman Antitrust Law says, no, government can go in and break things up. If there's a business that's too big, that's controlling too much, government can go in and break it up into pieces. And government has done that before. So Sherman Antitrust Law, meant to break up big trusts that are forming monopolies that can control, they're trying to control the prices. Now what they can also do A monopoly can also say, well, we don't have any competition. Nobody is selling hats at all. We're the only ones selling hats. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to sell them for $10. And they make a ton of money, right? But then somebody says, well, I can make them for $4, so they start selling them for $4 again. What do? As soon as that happens, they drop it back down to $1. Get this company out of business, and then put it back up to 10. So they can just control other businesses. So that's the Sherman antitrust law. Pretty important, still in use today, to break up big groups. I do want to talk about the Hepburn Act. The Hepburn Act made it so the government could control railroad prices. Because what was happening was railroads were getting friends. I like my friends, so I'm going to give them a cheap ride on the railroad. I'm going to carry their hats across the country for cheap. This other guy, I don't like him very much, so I'm going to charge him a lot to move his hats across the country. Well, what happens? The guy that gets the bad railroad deal can't compete because his hats cost too much because it costs too much to move them. So the government came in and said, well, wait a second, you can't do that. You've got to give the same prices to everybody. You can't cheat one company just because you don't like them, or because your buddy says, hey, you know, don't be nice to this company. I want them to go out of business. So the government came in and started to control railroad prices. Is that a good idea? A bad idea? Well, you can see why they wanted it to be fair. They did want it to be fair so that everybody could get, you know, not go out of business just because of the railroad prices. But then government is controlling prices. Should government really be controlling prices? Well, that becomes a little bit sticky because government's not very good at controlling prices, and we'll talk about that in our next packet for sure. But I do want you to be aware of the Hepburn Act. Another thing that happens during this time is you begin to see lots of worker compensation laws. Workers' compensation were laws that made it so that if you got hurt while you were working on the job, then you don't have to pay for it. Your company pays for it. And you see a lot of these starting to come up. Where, you know, if you got hurt, like let's say you worked in a coal mine, like one of those kids, if you got your arm broken or cut off or whatever, well, you couldn't work anymore. So now all of a sudden, you just like lost your job the rest of your life. Well, they didn't like that. They said, you know, businesses should pay for that if they get hurt on the job. And so there's still workers' compensation laws today that in many cases, if you get hurt while you're working on the job, your company pays for it. You don't pay for it. So this is a way to try to help make the working poor, make it better for them. All right, last one I do want to talk about is the 1907 panic. And I want to mention this mostly because we're going to talk about it with the Great Depression coming up. This 1907 panic, the stock market fell, investments fell 50%. This is huge, huge monetary catastrophe. Just wipes things out. Well, at this time, government had no way to fix it. We're going to talk about what government does to fix it coming up, and whether those are good choices or bad. But at this point, government has no way to fix it. They don't have any money. They don't have any control over the banks. The government can't do anything. Well, so what happens? The private sector comes in, and in this case, it was actually Mr. Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie comes in, and he starts investing lots of monies in businesses again, so that they can grow and the economy can start moving again. So Carnegie takes care of it, and you know, this panic of 1907 does not last very long. It's short. After this huge catastrophe, it's short. It lasts a couple years maybe, but there's no Great Depression. We're going to talk about the Great Depression coming up. There's no Great Depression. Mr. Carnegie seems to have fixed the problem by himself, and other people, too, then begin to gain the faith to put money into the economy and get it rolling. So, the 1907 panic, I want you to remember, first of all, that it was short, that government did not fix it. Because they couldn't. They had no way. I don't know, can you read it all the way down there? Hopefully it looks okay on the video. Government didn't fix it, but it was very short-lived. Mr. Carnegie fixed it, because we're going to contrast that with the stock market crash of 1929, where government did fix it, and we had the big Great Depression afterwards. So here's just an idea, a short idea, of some of the laws that government begins to pass to try to fix some of these problems. There's a lot more laws coming up in the next decades. But to give you an idea of how they tried to control business a little bit, how they tried to control railroad prices, how they tried to take care of the poor worker, and the panic, how the economic panic happened. Now here's one of the questions that I think we need to start looking at. Remember this. How much is too much for the government to step in? I think, if I'm guessing right, for the coal workers that we looked at, those kids who work all day, and the story that we read about them, about how they worked, I think most of us would agree that those kids probably did need some help, and it would be good for somebody to kind of speak up and help protect them a little bit. I think in those cases we could see why it's probably a good thing for government, but we're going to get into some of the things in the future that we're going to say, well, maybe that's government stepping in a little bit too much. Some of you may think right here, government controlling railroad prices. Some of you may think that's government stepping in too much. Some of you may even think workers' compensation is too much. So how far is too much for government to step in and help? That's going to be one of the really intriguing questions this whole year. Is government stepping in too much, or is government not stepping in enough? And we're going to keep asking that question. So here we go with the economy. Here's some ways the government tried to step in and help the economy.